Hi there. Welcome to Muslim Girl in America, 20 years after 9/11. This is a special live showing of WNY Studios and PRX's The Takeaway, a national daily show focused on news, conversation, culture, and politics. My name's Zachary Bynum, and I'm the digital producer for The Takeaway. On behalf of the production team, we want to thank you for being here and taking part in this important conversation we have lined up for you today. If you're a regular part of The Takeaway, you know that our show is truly a conversation. Our listeners are a big part of how we build each show. The same is true today. Join the conversation. During our time together, leave comments in our live posts, like and share on social media, and be sure to follow our Facebook page for updates. If you have any questions for our speakers, don't be shy. Leave a comment in the live post and tweet us at TheTakeaway using the hashtags #NeverForget, #Remembering 9/11, #Muslim Girl, and #TheTakeaway. We will be responding to many of your comments and questions later in the show. Now, I'd like to welcome our host for today's event, Melissa Harris Perry, interim host of The Takeaway. Melissa, take it away.
Oh, Zoom Life. Thank you so much, Zachary, for introducing us. And I also want to say thank you to the teams of The Takeaway, the WNYC team, and the Green Space for all of your work in making this event happen. And of course, thank you to everybody who's joining us. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, if you're watching us on Twitter, IG, TikTok, there's like all these platforms I don't even quite know about, but wherever you are joining us, thank you for tuning in, and we hope that you can stay with us for the hour. Now, as you heard from Zachary, my name is Melissa Harris Perry, and I'm the interim host for The Takeaway, and I am the full-time host for today's event. It's been 20 years since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And for those of us who were adults, that clear, sunny, bright blue sky day, it's indelibly etched in our memories. Most of us remember exactly where we were, precisely how we felt, just what it is that we feared, and maybe most of all, those of us who were adults, we remember everything that we lost on that day. For many of us, even 20 years later, our adulthood has a before and an after. And the fulcrum point is September 11th. For those of you who were children, or perhaps maybe not even born yet, the day itself might feel a little more distant and your recollections might be more dim. But even if you've lived your entire adulthood in the post 9/11 world, I assure you that the events of that day have marked your existence. They've shaped your possibilities, and they have molded the world that you know. Even before the smoke cleared in Lower Manhattan, amid the grief and the shock, many Americans began to feel as much fear about our nation's potential reactions as they felt about the now imminent threat of terrorism on American soil. And this fear was not just general and diffuse, it was specific. For many Americans, there was a fear of a violent retaliation and the possibility of abusive government action that would be taken against American Muslims. Now, in those early days and hours, even President George W. Bush seemed to understand the threat of Islamophobia. In fact, he specifically called on the American people to reject hate-fueled violence. So I want to just for a moment take a look at President Bush addressing the American people from the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., just 6 days after the attacks.
The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. When we think of Islam, we think of a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world. Muslims make an incredibly valuable contribution to our country. Muslims are doctors, lawyers, law professors, members of the military, entrepreneurs, shopkeepers, moms and dads, and they need to be treated with respect. Some don't want to go about their ordinary daily routines because by wearing cover, they're afraid they'll be intimidated. That should not and that will not stand in America.
And yet, despite these early calls condemning Islamophobia and calling for unity, the country immediately began to experience an acceleration of anti-Muslim crime and hate. The Southern Poverty Law Center recorded acts of vandalism, threats, attempted arson, and battery directed against Muslims on September 11th, September 12th, September 13th, and September 14th of 2001. And then on September 15th, 2001, now, I want you to take a look at this photo because this face, this man, he may not be familiar to you, but this is Balbir Singh Sodhi. It's a 49-year-old Sikh man. He was fatally shot outside of his own gas station while he was planting flowers. He was shot by a man who mistakenly believed that Sodhi's turban indicated that he was Muslim. Of course, despite the fact that a Sikh man is the first to die, this is critically about anti-Muslim violence. In fact, the FBI documented 481 incidents of anti-Muslim hate in 2001, 481. Let's take a look for a moment at the chart of FBI data, because what I want you to see here is that the year before, there were only 28 hate crimes directed at Muslims, but 481 in 2001. And as you can see from that chart, while the numbers did decline in the following years, these incidents remained and remain elevated. Incidents of crime and violence directed against Muslims has been 4 to 6 times greater every single year of the past 2 decades than it was at any point prior to September 11th. And typically the FBI records show 100 to 150 anti-Muslim hate incidents. And in 2016, coinciding with the presidential campaign and the election of Donald Trump, the number of anti-Muslim hate groups tripled. So it is also worth noting that Muslim women are particularly those who wear hijab, have shouldered a disproportionate burden of this hate. These public professions of faith and identity have marked Muslim women as targets in post 9/11 America. And so today, what we're going to do is to explore this vulnerability, but also to complicate this narrative as we discuss the lived experiences of Muslim American women during the past 2 decades. So let's get started. My first guest is a trailblazing young public upturned conventional assumptions and stereotypes about Muslim American girls and women. Let's take a look.
Especially with everything going on in the news today, I think it's especially pertinent for us to discuss how media misrepresentation impacts members of racial or cultural communities of marginalized backgrounds that are being targeted right now. And that's something that should not go ignored.
It's my pleasure to welcome Amani Al-Khataba. She is activist, author, tech entrepreneur, and undeniably fabulous influencer. Amani is the founder and editor-in-chief of MuslimGirl.com and author of Muslim Girl, A Coming of Age. Amani, thank you for joining us today.
Melissa, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so Amani, let's start with 9/11. You were quite young. What do you remember?
I remember a lot, actually, as young as I was, because of how severe life changed overnight. You know, even though you are a child, as children tend to do, you become very sensitive to the world around you, and especially how the world around you is treating you. And for me and my family, our lives were just completely turned upside down by this tragedy. I mean, I was born and raised in New Jersey. I grew up barely 30 miles away from Ground Zero. And 9/11 happened on my yearbook photo day when I was in elementary school. So it was definitely a significant day that's like seared into my memory. And what I remember the most after our unscheduled early dismissal that day was coming home to find my family huddled in the living room around our television set with what was happening on loop in front of us. And for me, I was still trying to perceive what that meant. What do you mean a plane flew into these buildings? What do you mean the buildings aren't there anymore? And my dad turned and looked at our family and said, they're going to blame us and it's going to get much worse. And from there, truly life as we knew it changed. I mean, for me, I was suddenly subject to extreme bullying in school. I heard my first racial slur in my elementary school classroom that same year. My family's, our house in our hometown was being targeted by the neighborhood kids that would water balloon and TP our home and egg it. And my family is, you know, the typical immigrant story where we've run an electronics store for most of my life. And as soon as 9/11 happened, the rest of the vendors in the flea market building where my family had their business band together to launch a petition to kick all of the Muslim businesses out of that building. So it was very significant, it was very trying, and it instilled a lot of fear into my young family. And I think that our story is among the most privileged of experiences immediately post 9/11.
I so appreciate you, your framework here, and offering us that perspective that even in a context of supposed maybe economic privilege, that that nonetheless the ways that this intervened meant that the identity Muslim became more important than you being a Jersey girl, more important than the fact that you all had gone to school together, right, with your colleagues. That it became the overwhelming identity.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that was definitely much more apparent to me after I decided to start wearing the headscarf. So I made that decision after my first trip to the Middle East, which my parents decided to do because they were, first of all, afraid that we would be subject to an Islamophobic hate crime here in New Jersey. But on top of that, they wanted to reacquaint us with our culture and our background and our religion outside of the propaganda that was really forcing us to distance ourselves from that identity. And in the Middle East, I really fell in love with the people and my background. And I got to see with my own eyes how different the reality was from the way that our people were being portrayed in American media. And so I decided to put on a headscarf for the first time. And to me, that was how I chose to reclaim my identity and how I wanted to express my defiance of Islamophobia. And sure enough, instantaneously, I lost so many friends in school. My educators started treating me differently. The first time that my mom got pulled over by a cop, who, by the way, I'm the only one that wears a headscarf in my family. My own mother doesn't wear one. It's her choice. And a police officer asked us, "Do you guys even speak English?" when he saw me wearing a headscarf for the first time. And, you know, being born and raised a Jersey girl, you can imagine just how shook I was, you know, kind of witnessing how different the treatment was suddenly. I mean, obviously it changed immediately post 9/11 as well, but then becoming a visible Muslim woman just amplified that.
So talk to me about that visibility. We watched a very brief moment where you were talking about media representation. What is, in your assessment, what still needs to be done? Because we are now 20 years from that moment. What are the ways that American media continues to misrepresent?
I think what defined my experience, I mean, what defined my childhood really, and my coming of age, my formative years, was this idea being shoved down on me that Muslim women are oppressed, that we are voiceless, that we need to be liberated, and we have to be liberated by the West. And that to me was such a disempowering notion that was just so far from reality or what my religion really stood for, the way that so many women like myself practiced it, that idea, that narrative really set the foundation for a lot of the horrible foreign policies, the failed foreign policies now, you know, hindsight is 2020, that were really formed on our backs as Muslim women. You know, in large part, this idea of us being oppressed was used by the media, by our own government even, to transform this political war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, to becoming a humanitarian one, as if the whole reason why we were going into Afghanistan was to liberate women and girls, when we know that obviously women and girls were the most devastated by that horrible decision. And now 20 years later, with the recent updates that have been happening in Afghanistan, all as a result of our intervention there. You saw kind of the same narrative start sprouting back up again, that, oh, we have to save the women and girls there. That's our biggest concern. And so that narrative still exists. And it's one that I think also feeds a lot of the Islamophobia that we see today, because it also creates this narrative that Muslim women need to be saved from Muslim men. And then obviously it creates this hatred towards Muslim men as a whole in our entire background. And this time around, you kind of saw that start coming back to life again with the headlines around Afghanistan. But I do think that it's different this time around, 20 years later, because for the first time in my lifetime, I'm seeing far more nuance being injected into the conversation, a lot more pushback, and a lot more minority communities even that recognize the adversity that Muslim Americans have been subject to and are standing in solidarity with us, and have been for the past several years with what we've been enduring still. So I think that things have changed, but unfortunately the hate is still there. It's still the same.
One of the things that I most appreciate about your story is your parents' decision to protect you, not only through a exit and then return, but that part of what you have to do is to build a hedge of self-regard around children. It's certainly a struggle that many of us as Black parents have, right? That when the world is telling you that you are worthless, you have to build that up from the inside. And so when I visit muslimgirl.com, when I assign the book Muslim Girl, I do it in part because it does have that sense of great joy to be who you are, which isn't just about having to always respond to Islamophobia. So talk to us a little bit about Muslim Girl and its trajectory over the course of the years that it has existed.
I created Muslim Girl when I was a teenager. It was sometime after 9/11. It was after I had to kind of grow up through this really adverse atmosphere, this climate of hate. And I couldn't find the spaces in real life that I so desperately needed, the safe space for the support and for the space to share a lot of those lived experiences that I felt like were very unique and even novel to my generation. And so creating Muslim Girl was a way to create a platform for us to reclaim that narrative, to talk back to the media, and to have the conversations amongst ourselves about our identities that we were robbed of growing up, because the news was so busy trying to shove down our throats what our identities were. And so since then, Muslim Girl went from being a bedroom hobby of mine to growing to become a movement of its own. It's now the biggest English language platform for Muslim women's voices to talk back to the issues impacting our daily lives. And we've been able to really transform and rebrand the image of Muslim women in so many different industries, not just the media, because we feel that Muslim women are on the front lines of people's understanding and engagement with our community. And I think that we have come a long way, but there's still so much more left to be done. I think that when we started Muslim Girl, the hope was to change public opinion about us, about our community, in a way that will, in the long run, shape policy. And that has come to fruition. Muslim Girl has had an impact on conversations happening in Congress now. But the truth is that a lot of policies from the height of the war are still in place today and are still oppressing and intervening in our communities in ways that are very destructive to our civil rights. And that is still an utmost priority.
Amani, thank you so much. Stick with me. Do not leave. But I do want to bring one more voice into our conversation, in part because it's always so important. None of us speak exclusively or are forced to speak exclusively for our communities. So let me pause and give you a little something to watch here. I want you all to see our next guest in action.
My body is mine. It does not belong to the state. It does not belong to the mosque. It does not belong to the church, the synagogue, or wherever else you worship. It does not belong to my family. It belongs to me.
Please welcome Mona El-Tahawy, who is writer of the Feminist Giant newsletter and author of the books, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, and Headscarves and Hymens by the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. Mona, welcome.
Hi, Melissa. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm always so pleased to talk with you. Now, I want to start in the same place that I did with Amani. You were an adult on September 11th. Can you tell us some of your recollections and your immediate reactions from that day?
Sure. I had moved to the United States the year before 9/11. I moved to the US in the summer of 2020. I married an American, and we were living in Seattle at the time of the attacks. My brother and his wife were visiting us. And I remember the phone rang at 6 a.m. It just would not stop ringing. And it was my late ex-mother-in-law, because I'm now divorced and she has passed. And I picked up the phone and she said, turn the television on, turn the television on. Something terrible is happening in New York. The towers are falling. We turned the TV on. I ran upstairs to wake up my brother and his sister. And I remember I turned to them and I said to them, if this is Muslims, they're going to round us up. We're going to be put in camps. I was terrified. And we did not leave the house for 2 days because my sister-in-law wore hijab, wore a headscarf, and we were really worried about her. We were in Seattle, which is supposedly this progressive, liberal city, but we were really worried about her. And our worries were not unfounded because just a couple of days after 9/11, a man tried to set our local mosque on fire in Seattle. He was too drunk, and two Muslim men coming out of congregational prayers tried to stop him as he was pouring gasoline on the, near the mosque grounds, and he tried to shoot them. And, that, like I said, our fears were not unfounded, but soon after this failed arson attempt, the neighborhood around the mosque, not Muslims, but the non-Muslims around the mosque flooded the door of the mosque with bouquets of flowers, because my now ex-husband drove us to the mosque to make sure everyone was okay. And there were just flowers everywhere and notes of support from the people in the neighborhood. And for the next 2 months, there were two people from those neighbors around the mosque standing guard outside the mosque every day, holding up signs saying Muslims are Americans, to protect the mosque. So that was September of 2001. And, you mentioned the attacks against Muslims, and we talked about visibly Muslim women. I had a Muslim friend, a Muslim woman friend at the time, who, like me, does not wear a headscarf. She is visibly she's brown, so I don't think that these racists could tell that she was South Asian. But she was leaving a restaurant in Seattle, again, liberal, progressive Seattle, when a group of white men shouted at her white husband, "What does it feel like to fuck a terrorist?" So, anyone who did not look white, anyone who was suspected, quote unquote, of being a Muslim was being targeted for hate.
Mona, I think, again, what I so appreciate about your reflections there is both the multiple levels of terror, the reality of being targeted in that way, and that it's always complicated, right? And that there are neighbors who are standing there, right, and guarding the mosque. So I want to dig into one thing with you, and then we'll bring Amani back in and we'll all be together. But as Amani is talking about the challenges of American foreign policy and the discourse surrounding it that so frequently seeks to pit brown women against brown men in a variety of different ways, or to level a critique against Islam, I'm wondering about the ways that external critique might make it even harder to make the necessary internal critiques.
Absolutely, Melissa. I so appreciate your question. This is why I love joining you on any show, wherever you are. I often think over the past 20 years, just how much further the conversation among Muslim women who are feminists would have gone if we weren't constantly caught between what I call a rock and a hard place. And the rock is, Islamophobes and racists who themselves are misogynists. I mean, look at Donald Trump. He's not exactly your, paragon of feminism. And look at the people who vote for Donald Trump, a man accused of multiple sexual assaults. So that's the rock. But there's also a hard place. Now, the rock is misogynist, as I said, but the hard place is the misogynists from our own community. Now, what The Rock does is they're like, we've got to save Muslim women from Muslim men. And, you know, they don't even listen to us. They speak over us. And the hard place are the misogynists from our community who want us to shut up because they accuse us of giving ammunition to the Rock. So you've got these two misogynists outside the community, inside the community, both speaking over us. And I'm like, fuck you and fuck you. Neither of you should be speaking for me. I'm sorry, I promised your producer I would not be swearing. But, you know, neither of them should be speaking over us. And they're literally speaking over us because they want us to shut up, and they're speaking to each other. So imagine how much further and how much more complicated the conversation would have been if it had been a conversation among Muslim women, led by Muslim women who look as differently as I do and Imani does, who in the United States, it's almost like a half-half split. 50% of American Muslim women wear hijab, 50% don't. But the majority of time, when you see Muslim women on the media, they are wearing headscarves. Why? Where am I in that conversation? So this is a very complicated and necessarily difficult conversation.
I love where you've brought us to. I want to bring Amani back into the conversation so that all of us can be here together. I feel like that rock and hard place that you've just described feels so familiar to me as a survivor of sexual assault, as someone who knows that the most horrifying violence ever done personally against me has been done by Black men. At the same time, my father is a Black man, my brother is a Black man, my beloved husband is a Black man. I am completely capable of both having a critique of the patriarchy that leads to violence against my body and a critique of the white supremacy that would seek to round up my husband and my brother and my father right along with, and in fact, actually doesn't even care one way or another about my rapist. So let's talk about how feminism puts us in that space. So Amani, I want to come to you. I've heard you and read you write and think about Muslim feminism. For you, what are the sort of aspects of it or the difficulties of it? How do you even define it?
I mean, I think that for the majority of my life before I started Muslim Girl, feminism was definitely really portrayed through this white savior complex type of lens, where so many women of color, not just Muslim women, felt completely excluded from that narrative. And when it comes to Muslim women, you can totally see how feminism has been twisted whenever it's convenient. You know, for example, like what we were just talking about with what Afghanistan has been portrayed, you know, that we have to be noble and go in there and save women and girls and America's biggest concern right now and all that stuff. But within the same week as this all was going down, we saw what happened in Texas, where women effectively lost their abortion rights. We also had our biggest ally and recipient of US support in the Middle East, Israel, hold a pregnant woman ready to go into labor any second in a military prison and refusing to let her out. And obviously the list is innumerable, but all of that happening at the same time as we're trying to say that our foreign policy, you know, when it comes to war against Muslim bodies, somehow has a noble cause behind it, is intended to save women. That's not saving anybody. That truly is the definition of our oppression. And I think that was the biggest cognitive dissonance that I experienced growing up. It's like, people are saying that I'm oppressed because of my religion, but what is oppressing me is you telling me that, is you treating me that way and acting like we don't have a voice, speaking on my behalf and acting in a way that is detrimental, that's destructive to my community, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And I think that really the whole goal has been in reclaiming that narrative in the media and telling our own stories and holding that pen has been to show that, you know, we are the ones that have to lead this conversation. You know, this is how we define it for ourselves. I think that's the most important thing.
Mona, I want to let you in on this same question around the intersections of Muslim and feminist.
Right, you know, I was born in Egypt, Melissa, and I grew up in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things that was central to my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, was to deeply examine patriarchy but also to trace a history of feminism that is indigenous to the region that is sometimes called the Middle East, but is also more increasingly called Southwest Asia. And I talk about Muslim women who launched feminism in Egypt in the 1920s. There was an Egyptian woman called Hoda Sha'rawi in the 1920s in Egypt, who, very a contemporary of the suffragists in the UK. I talk about Saudi feminists. I talk about Iraqi feminists. Talk about a Moroccan sociologist called Fatima Mernissi, and an Egyptian feminist called Nawal Saadawi. And sadly, they both passed away, who were instrumental to my own development as a feminist. But I also talk in my second book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, which looks at patriarchy around the world, including in the United States, at what are known as Islamic feminists. And I mention a Black American Muslim scholar called Amina Wadud. And one of the highlights of these awful past 2 decades for me, as a Muslim woman in the United States since the 9/11 attacks, was I became part of a movement called Progressive Islam. And that first movement, we were part of something called the Progressive Muslim Union of North America. And in 2005, we co-sponsored one of the most moving events of my life. And it was a Friday prayer. This is the communal prayer for Muslims that was led by a woman imam. And her name is Dr. Amina Wadud. And it was the first time that a woman publicly led Muslim women and men praying side by side in a Friday prayer. This happened because there were Muslims in the United States forced into a visibility that they had not chosen because of 9/11, but also forced into these difficult conversations that we're talking about. So this feminism belongs to me. It belongs to me as a woman who was born in Egypt. It belongs to me as a Muslim woman who has been on pilgrimage 4 times to Islam's holiest site in Saudi Arabia, where I grew up as a teenager. And it belongs to me as a woman who moved to the United States in the year 2000 and who was part of that foundational progressive Muslim movement. And that Muslim movement now continues through a group called Muslims for Progressive Values that was founded by a friend of mine who was part of the Progressive Muslim Union. So as awful as the past 2 decades have been, we have engaged in this very difficult and necessary conversation around feminism that is not come and save me. I don't want anyone to save me, I'm saving myself. But that is listen to me and stop talking over me.
Mona, you did so much important work there. One critical aspect of it is when you talk about pilgrimage, you bring us back, you root us, you remind us. It's something I heard this morning. My colleague, Brian Laird, was having a really lovely conversation with callers from the New York area. And the conversation about Islam in the US post 9/11 is almost exclusively political. Rather than thinking about the sacred, that Islam is not primarily an ideology or at all an ideology, that it is a faith and a set of claims and practices and beliefs. And so, Amani, let me come to you on this. If I'd just welcome you again, also to maybe offer some framework in the ways that that Islam as faith, and cultural practice and family, and not just as sort of a political or space of suffering, has been part of the journey for the past 20 years for you.
Well, I think that a large part of that has been expanding the feminist discourse for those of us that believe that our rights are inherently within our own religion as well. You know, there are so many Muslim women that feel empowered by our faith and empowered by our communities and feel that we shouldn't have to compromise any of those values or principles in order to be included within that conversation about women's rights and gender rights. And I think that the way that Muslim women are kind of put into a box, you know, the way that we're portrayed in the media, we all have one set look, you know, always with a scarf on our heads. Oftentimes, before Muslim Girl came onto the scene, the only images that you saw online of Muslim women were of us hidden behind black face veils, looking depressed and victimized. And one of the most problematic parts of that is that we started treating Muslim Americans like they're the other, like they're an immigrant, like they're an outsider that don't belong here. When the fact of the matter is that Islam has been in America since day one. I mean, the earliest Muslims that were here in the States were brought here forcibly on slave ships from Africa and built this country. But we don't talk about the generations of Muslims that have been here for centuries. We only try to make it seem like this is a foreign, a foreign religion, a foreign ideology that doesn't belong here. And that in itself is obviously extremely problematic and has been adding on to how devastating a lot of this treatment and narrative around Muslims has been for the past 2 decades. But I think the most important thing to remember as well is that when we're talking about feminism, right, it's not just about gender. It's about so many other societal forms of justice across the board, whether that's social, gender, racial, financial, and economic. And we have to recognize that the problem here, and this is the issue, is that we turn the conversation so much on placing Muslims on the defensive, where we have to constantly explain our religion, denounce terrorism, say that no, Islam does not equate to extremism. Muslim women have to once again explain that no, I'm not oppressed by Islam. I swear it gives me my rights. Otherwise, why would I be in it? I have a brain and think for myself, But the questions we should be asking are, why have we allowed the media misrepresentation of Muslims and Islam to pull the veil over our eyes, literally, for our government to take away civil rights in the name of national security, in the name of this abstract enemy, right? Like NC's program, which came to be during the war on terror and still existed under Obama, was an actual nationwide database of Muslim men from a list of Muslim countries that we kept here, right? Like literally only men from specific Muslim countries. Never mind the fact that Muslims come from every walk of life on the planet and every country on the planet, right? But this existed years before Trump's Muslim ban even became part of the conversation. Similarly, we still have the Patriot Act, which basically eliminates our due process rights as long as we come from our Muslim faith, and somehow there's an accusation of terrorism there, even if not a single charge comes on you. But the Patriot Act allowed such invasive surveillance to take place within the Muslim community. And if we want to talk about feminism, let's talk about how Muslim women have been impacted by watching their fathers, brothers, husbands get abducted from the safety of their homes with no explanation, and many times to never be seen again. These things they happened immediately after 9/11, and they're still happening. Those policies are still in place. And that's what we should be focusing on. Like especially now that I'm in my 20s, I'm sick and tired of having spent my entire life talking about Muslim women. No, let's actually talk about what's really important here and why we're allowing this treatment to take place within this time period right now. It's 2021.
Mona, I want to just let you respond.
My brother was one of those Muslim men who had to submit to what this program called special registration. He and his Muslim friends, because it was a list of 25 countries, and 24 of those countries were mostly in the so-called Arab world. And they had to have their pictures taken, they had to be fingerprinted, and they were put into a special registry. They couldn't move without checking in with the FBI. They couldn't leave the country without getting security clearance. My brother did not leave the United States for 10 years straight because he was worried that he would lose his student visa and his work and his income, because several of his Muslim friends did. And I talked about how we were together in Seattle when the 9/11 attacks happened, and a man unsuccessfully tried to set my local mosque on fire. That same brother of mine lives in the Midwest, where he submitted to so-called special registration. And an arsonist actually succeeded in setting his mosque on fire in 2012. So that's 11 years after the 9/11 attacks. My nieces and nephews were in that mosque just hours before it was gutted by a fire by a man who said that he had watched Fox News, and Fox News had told him that, or he learned from Fox News, that Muslims were killing Americans around the world, and he wanted to fight back and teach Muslims a lesson. And so he set a mosque in the Midwest on fire. So that mosque took a while, they fundraised and they rebuilt again. And I'm bringing it up, not just to talk about how it was set on fire, as many other many other mosques around the country were set on fire. But you told Melissa about Islam being faith and culture and family and community. But I went to visit that mosque in 2018, because once a year they have an open day where they invite the community in their town in the Midwest to come. And every member of the mosque community it's like a food, kind of like come and taste our food kind of thing. So there was the Egyptian table where we were all serving people food. There was the Afghan table, there was the Syrian, Palestinian, and they were inviting people in to see the mosque, which had just, opened just a few years earlier. And it was such a beautiful mosque. It's one of the oldest mosques in the US. It's one of the most progressive mosques in the US, where, again, Muslims pray side by side. And I looked at that mosque and I looked at my nieces and nephews, all of whom were born after 9/11. My oldest niece, who just went to university, was born in 2003. And these kids, my nieces and nephews, grew up with this awful, awful hate in the background that they had nothing to do with. And just 5 days before my brother's mosque was set on fire, and completely coincidental, not related at all, I was arrested in New York City because I spray painted over a racist, pro-Israel, bigoted ad in the New York subway. And I spray painted over this ad, and I spent the night in jail because I was sick and tired of Muslim kids especially, like my nieces and nephews, being bullied by hatred, being constantly put on the defensive and having to apologize for something they had nothing to do with. And the year before this campaign, this ad campaign that I spray painted over, it was the year before the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the woman responsible for this hate is a woman called Pamela Geller. She went around calling a community center in South Manhattan called Park 51. She started calling it the Ground Zero Mosque. And I was part of the Muslim community that protested on behalf of that. I don't go to mosques and I don't go to community centers. My faith is very, very private, and I don't take part in community centers in New York. However, I am politically determined to chase down these Islamophobes and white supremacists and give them hell wherever they are. And Pamela Geller set her mind to this horrific hate campaign against Park 51. So I was part of the Muslim community that defended it in 2010, and I intentionally went and spray painted over her campaign because I am sick and tired. I refuse to allow my nieces and nephews to grow up in a country where being Muslim, where being brown, and being Egyptian is going to be used against them for something they had nothing to do with. Their father was visited by the FBI a month after 9/11 and by a special agent and asked, do you know anyone who celebrated 9/11? What the actual hell, and had to be subjected to this special registration. So enough. And also, in addition to Patriot Act and special registration, hello, Guantanamo. How is the richest, most powerful country, the so-called, the democracy of the world, still holding countless Muslim men with no charge whatsoever, 20 years later, torturing them, subjecting them to force feeding? In Guantanamo is the biggest shame of the past 2 decades. Why hasn't it closed down? So I'm like, the horrors that Muslims have been subjected to, Melissa, are endless, whether they're personal or a communal level.
I feel like we need to just breathe long enough to receive it. And as I'm listening to you speak, and I'm the horror I felt as you were talking about your nieces and nephews being there in the mosque before it set afire, and I'm thinking of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, Alabama, when both of you are talking about the registry, and I'm thinking about what this country did to Japanese Americans during World War II, forcibly removing and incarcerating, that these are not aberrations in the American story that just appeared after 9/11, that this has been the kind of horrors that you're talking about is so foundational, so core to the to so many American experiences. And yet, and this is where I want to go back to something you mentioned, Imani, just to bring in one of the questions from Facebook. And yet, at the same time, America belongs to us as well, right? So that idea that I refuse to allow America, which is mine, to behave this way towards Islam, which is mine. So as you sort of gave us that history, Amani, of Black-skinned African-derived Muslims here in the US, we have a question that came in from Twitter from @TheEricaJ asking, how do we amplify the experiences of Black Muslims and ensure that their experiences are also part of what we talk about in the post 9/11 narratives as we're kind of doing this commemorative work?
I mean, it's so necessary for us to make sure that Black Muslims are part of the conversation. I think the horrible part about the way that we've treated our foreign policies, again, that we have been speaking about Islam like it's some foreign concept. And even for the Muslim American community, for a lot of us, and for myself, as having been a child when 9/11 happened, it's so easy to think that Islamophobia started at that point in the timeline, but it didn't. And it also is so easy to get caught up in anti-Muslim sentiment and forget about the racism that also is another added layer to that. For Black Muslims, they not only have to deal with anti-Muslim sentiment, but they also have to deal with racism that trumps that, because not anyone might be able to identify you as a Muslim, but you can't change the color of your skin. You can't control the way that people are going to treat you because of that. And so I think that one of the most important things is to recognize that the Black struggle and the Muslim struggle are absolutely intertwined. And for Muslims, for the Muslim American community, and personally, I believe for any minority in America, our liberation follows Black liberation. It can only come after Black liberation. And once we have Black liberation, it's gonna fall into place for the rest of us. But I think that solidarity and that intersectionality between our communities is the only way that we'll even get there. Because one thing that I also saw, for me personally, especially with, of course, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and our own modern day civil rights movement, is this disconnect that has existed for a long time. I mean, I have conducted interviews with so many Muslim American leaders that were at the forefront of the response in 2001 during 9/11. Both Arab and South Asian Muslim leaders and Black Muslim leaders as well. And it is very apparent that there was no type of cooperation or even communication between parties at all. And to even just imagine the way that fragmentation has impacted our political power, right? And the impact that we've been able to have as a people in this country. It's quite shameful. And I think that the only way that we can move forward is to make sure that we build up that solidarity, which I do think has tremendously changed. I do credit, I think, the young generation for really taking the reins, and the new guard for stepping up, that is looking at the world with completely different eyes. That we have seen a lot of that change recently. And I think that increased solidarity is the only way that we were able to survive the Trump era, and get through it the way that we have, as devastating as that was. But building up that strength, I think, is the direction needed to go forward. And I might be biased because of my work with feminism and with Muslim Girl, but I truly believe that it's going to be women and our sisterhood that's going to make that happen.
Mona, I want to build off of Amani sort of mentioning here this moment of the Trump era. And I just want to ask you, we've been talking about sort of 9/11, the post 9/11 moment, how you felt, how you responded, what happened relative to politics and culture. So let me ask you about a different moment that could be read and understood as a moment of terrorism on American soil. Let's talk about January 6th. And I'm wondering if you were shocked and surprised that there wasn't, a registration for white boys after that.
Melissa, it has been incredible, and I don't mean it in a good way. I mean, incredulous maybe, to watch the reaction following the insurrection, following January 6th. And, I want to tie that to what also happened in Texas with the abortion case, with the election of Trump, and with the growing boldness of white supremacy and Christian fundamentalism in this country. And, very soon after I arrived in the United States, because I moved here in the year 2000, and, I'd been a news reporter in the Middle East for over 10 years. I'm from Cairo, from Jerusalem. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, like I said. So I was very familiar with following Islamic fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism when I lived in Jerusalem. And here I am in the United States. And it became very clear very soon after I arrived that Christian was the default and white was another default. And if you were a white Christian and you wanted your religion in your politics, that was perfectly fine. And if you invaded the capital, the height, the seat of American political power, holding up signs saying Jesus is our Lord, and basically wanting to assassinate the vice president. So wanting to assassinate the second most powerful person in the US and the third, Nancy Pelosi. But because you're Christian and you're white, it was what? It was perfectly okay. Some of them were calling themselves revolutionaries. Who went to their home and asked them, do you know anyone who celebrated January 6th? Who was insisting that they submit to a special registration where they are fingerprinted and photographed and they can't move house without alerting the FBI? Who indoctrinated them and made them into these radicals? And who is apologizing to the rest of us for the terror that they subjected us to? So clearly, there are not just double standards, there are triple and quadruple standards in the United States, depending on your religion, your ethnic background, your gender, your class, your ableism, your sexuality, your gender, so much. And January 6th, I mean, if the election of Donald Trump was a reminder, because Donald Trump is not an aberration. This is why, thank you for reminding us of Alabama, Melissa, and the church bombings by white supremacists, and the internment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps. This is white supremacy at work. And white supremacy is the reason that Donald Trump was elected. And white supremacy is the reason that my brother's mosque was set on fire. And white supremacy and its terrorism is the reason that the insurrection on January the 6th has not had as massive a consequence on the evangelical community as 9/11 had on the Muslim community. And additionally, I want to remind people that COVID-19 has killed more Americans than 9/11 had. And I hold Donald Trump and Fox News and all of those other propaganda outlets directly responsible for a form of genocide that has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, Brown, and disabled and working class Americans. And yet, who is being held accountable to that? Multiple times Americans have been killed because of COVID than they were on 9/11. This is not to excuse or diminish 9/11, but this is to remind people that white supremacy gets away with multiple crimes, and it's time to hold it accountable.
What I want to do in our final moments together, because I always want to remind viewers and listeners and even ourselves that the sum of our experiences of struggle, of oppression are crucial, but they are not the totality of who we are, and that our humanity is always more robust and complex than that. So I want to pause and breathe for one moment. And then I want to do one of my favorite things, which is this speed round. I promise this is just fun. But I just want to know a little bit about the humanity of you that is not necessarily connected to the politics. So I just have a few questions. I want you both to answer them to the extent that you want to jump in. But here's the first speed round question. If you could assign one book for every American girl to read, what would that book be?
Probably The Kite Runner is the first book that came to my mind. And I think especially with what's happening in Afghanistan, it's a really good book to read right now.
That's a great one. You have one, Mona?
Yes, I would assign Dr. Amina Wadud's Inside the Gender Jihad, the book in which she talks about why she led the Friday prayer as a woman imam, and that she talks about Islamic feminism. I'm not an Islamic feminist, but I think that Dr. Amina Wadud and the way that she challenges misogyny and patriarchy within various Islamic traditions is absolutely essential.
When do you feel most powerful?
Oh, that's a good one, Melissa. Honestly, I probably feel the most powerful when I'm with my family and they're safe and they're good and they're healthy. Um, then the other answer to that question would be that I feel the most powerful when I have a pen in my hand. The pen is mightier than the sword, and that's always been my weapon of choice. So,
Yes, as a writer, I absolutely understand that. Mona, when do you feel most powerful?
I feel most powerful when I'm putting together Feminist Giant, which is my newsletter, which is free, by the way. So subscribe. You don't have to pay anything unless you want to. So there are two paid interns who put together this incredible global roundup of feminist resistance to the patriarchy around the world. It decenters whiteness and it decenters the so-called West. And it shows you feminist resistance around the world. And then on the weekend, I publish my essay in which I basically swear at everything that has to do with the patriarchy, regardless of where it is. And that's why I call it Feminist Giant, because we are feminist giants.
Oh, I love that. And I also love that both of you, it's that communication. It's that moment of writing, of expressing the ideas, of building community through words and ideas. All right. Is there any one surprising thing that you learned about yourself in the context of the early COVID-19 quarantine, when you were maybe alone with yourself more than you have been before?
at the beginning of COVID quarantine, actually, the first week of the outbreak, my mom caught COVID. And I decided to run for Congress in New Jersey, which was the hardest thing that I'd ever done in my life. But to me, it felt like that moment, the beginning of COVID, really brought to light how urgent the moment is for us to create sweeping progress for our communities, and that there was no time to wait. So I think that probably was at the forefront of my mind once the quarantine fell upon us, is how do we fight back?
Mona?
For me, it was shaving all my hair off because I used to have long red hair. You might remember, Melissa.
Remember very well.
Very soon into the pandemic, I shaved all my hair off because I wanted to emerge as the different person that I am, because I didn't want to emerge looking as if I'd been on vacation at home for 2 or 3 months. And so it was shaving my hair off and also launching Feminist Giant and keeping it free, because I want feminism to be accessible to everyone. And I want feminism to represent as many people as possible. So Indigenous, Black, Brown, from around the world, with my buzz cut, saying that we will emerge and we must emerge into a better world because we deserve a better world.
I also really like the blue. I loved the red, but the blue is also, it's a nice moment. I want to say thank you to Mona El-Tahawy for joining me today, and to Amani Al-Kataba. Amani, I have done your name wrong so many times. Will you pronounce your
Girl,
your last name?
You can call me Amani.
But I want to do better than that. So let's have it.
It's Amani El-Katatba.
Al-Kataba. I can do that. I can do better.
When my parents immigrated here, they got a little too excited and threw in a bunch of extra consonants. But
I love it. All of it. We should be there in our full selves, and our lazy American tongues must do better. Thank you both for joining me. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your insights, your truths. And just thank you for spending a little time with us. I'm going to turn this back over to Zachary Bynum, our digital producer, for the takeaway.
Thanks, Melissa. I just want to say to our audience, thanks for joining us for Muslim Girl 20 years after 9/11. This has been a special event by The Takeaway in a partnership of WNYC Studios and PRX. Let me also take a minute to thank some of our partners for today: NPR, MuslimGirl.com, Facebook app, the Anna Julia Cooper Center, and another special shout out to our entire production team at The Takeaway and WNYC's The Green Space for today's production. If you liked today's event, follow us on social media at The Takeaway to stay updated on everything we're doing. You can also catch our daily radio show and podcast on wnycstudios.org/podcast/The Takeaway. We appreciate you for being here and being a part of today's show. I'm signing off. Bye.